Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Miriam Farah, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for the school year. In 2020, during the Black Lives Matter protests, discussions about systemic racism emerged across the nation. Many people began to think about systemic racism not only in policing and in the criminal legal system more broadly, but also in education, healthcare, and many other institutions. However, many Black Americans and other organizers have been discussing these injustices since the country's founding. And as people continue to reckon with racial injustice in the US, it's important to understand its history and engage with Black history as well, in order to understand why we have different perceptions about our own past. Tonight we have with us Professor Phia Salter from Davidson College, who will talk about the history's social and psychological implications on contemporary racial relations. By using critical race and cultural psychological perspectives, Professor Salter will offer a unique approach to understanding the relationship between collective memory, racial identity, and systemic racism in the US. At Davidson, she teaches courses on cultural psychology, Black psychology, and the history of psychology, all of which empowers students to identify, challenge, and dismantle various systems of oppression. She has also been awarded several awards for her teaching. For one, the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues awarded Professor Salter an Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award. Professor Salter's Athenaeum presentation tonight is supported by CMC's Presidential Initiative on Anti-Racism and the Black Experience in the US. Before getting started, I wanted to remind everyone of two quick things. Please take this time right now to silence and put away your cell phones. And please remember that both visual and audio recordings by the audience are strictly prohibited. Now please join me in welcoming Professor Salter.
Thank you so much for the introduction. You want to come back and give the talk? That was just, it's beautiful. Okay, so, I like to begin by just telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from. So as Miriam suggested, I'm currently at Davidson College, but I also started there as an undergraduate. And every institution that I've engaged in or been a part of has had an influence on the kind of work that I do, the kind of questions I've asked. I've spent time both at predominantly white institutions, historically Black colleges, also abroad, the University of Cape Coast in Ghana. And at each of these different places, including University of Kansas, has really challenged me to think about what it means to be Black in these different contexts and settings, and how much context can influence your psychological experiences. And so I'm going to take you on a journey with me. We'll first talk about how I apply some cultural insights to the study of racism. I'll point out briefly some connections between critical race theory and cultural psychology. Then I am a psychologist, a social scientist, so I'm going to speak to you in data today. I'm going to give you two empirical examples that look at the relationship between knowledge of history and critical interventions, perhaps trying to boost perceptions of racism. And then I'll end with just sort of looking forward. So I told you where I come from, just sort of geographically in the different intellectual spaces that I've engaged in, but I also want to tell you where I'm coming from theoretically. So I was trained as a cultural psychologist, and really cultural psychology has been largely defined as the study of mutual constitution. And really what this means is that psychological experience is shaped by cultural context, but also our cultural contexts are shaped by the beliefs, the attitudes, our behaviors, our actions, and how that impacts the context or the world. And as a cultural psychologist, I've been thinking about the relationship between race and racism as a societal factor and pervasive idea, and how that might impact psychological experiences, our behaviors and actions, but also more likely to see voter suppression as a racism relevant issue in comparison to their white counterparts. So you might be wondering, okay, so what went on with the treatment? Did anything happen with exposing people to these different facts? For Black Americans, not much, right? They're actually already above the midpoint in thinking that these policies and voter suppression are racism relevant, right? You can almost, and also how much they identify with being Black wasn't really having an effect either. They're just somewhat high. So for white Americans, in the control condition, you can see that they're lower than our Black American participants. And those who identify, lowly or highly with white identity, in the control condition, they're about the same. They're around the midpoint, but, racism, not necessarily a strong factor in these policies and voter suppression. But what happened when we exposed them to our critical history facts? It actually mattered about how they were identifying with being white. For our, participants who had sort of low levels of identification with whiteness, actually the treatment condition brings them up to about the same levels of our Black American participants, right? They increase in comparison to a control their perceptions that voter suppression is a racism relevant problem, that these policies do have something to do with racism. Our participants who highly identify with being white, though, we see a backlash, right? In comparison to the control, they're even less likely to say that these voting policies are racism relevant or that voter suppression is a racism relevant problem. And so, I've been thinking a bit about how knowledge of historical racism can be a tool or a lens through which we understand racism today, and that it's important for us to think about the ways we can support and increase our awareness of privilege and how racism is operating in society and how that might facilitate fighting injustice. But it also comes with negative responses and backlash that might undermine those same efforts. So at the table, we were talking about what's going on in Florida, right? So critical race theory, we don't know what it is, but it's bad. Woke, we don't know what that is either, but it's bad. It really, right, these are dog whistles for, talking about or discussing racism in our society, whether it's in the past or in the present. And so, even the censorship of what I would suggest is a collective memory, right? These narratives and these accounts of, again, historically documented events, an intention to erase them from our collective consciousness, and doing so within the education system. And I want to suggest that, these strict voter ID laws or even just other restrictions on voting, they're not isolated. One, I don't know if you noticed, they pop up really in 2010. There's some Supreme Court cases that match that, but it also just happens to be after the election of our first Black president. And it's also notable that the places where restrictions on voting is happening and restrictions on critical education are often happening in those same places. So, I want to suggest that this is not about protecting children, it's about protecting power. And so I want to end by suggesting that we need to build and support the context that promote anti-racist people and anti-racist worlds. So in this cultural psychology analysis or telling of what's going on, we think about how racism is shaping how we see the world and what we want to do about it. But it's not just that those contexts shape us to be racist. I would like to suggest that we can build contexts that might shape us to be anti-racist and to invest in that. And that's going to take action, because both action and inaction might shape the kind of context that we're living in. And I just want to end with a brief metaphor. Some of you have heard or read me say this. But if we think about culture, right, as water to fish, right, it's everywhere. We may not necessarily see it, but it's impacting our everyday lives. If we think about replacing race and racism with this notion, well, then the water is toxic, right? And so we can talk about, okay, what can we do to change the hearts and minds of our little fish swimming in the toxic water? Or we can talk about how do we clean the bowl out? How do we change the water? How do we address racism in the context? And with that, I will say thank you for your attention and time, and thank you so much for having me here. And I'm fairly sure I left time for questions. And sorry, I would be remiss if I did not also, thank my collaborators and my research assistants. Particularly, I want to shout out Maria Rojas. The voting policy and voter suppression study was actually her senior thesis. So, yeah, I know undergrads do great work. So, as you make, reaching for that April deadline, you can do it.
Thank you, Professor Salter, for the really insightful talk. So as she mentioned, she will be taking questions right now. So if you have a question, please line up at one of these 2 microphones. And before you ask your question, introduce yourself with your name and your major.
Yes, don't be shy.
Hello, I'm Melanie Kala. I am a sophomore at Claremont McKenna College studying international relations. So some context before I ask my question. I'm one of the many students on this campus who focuses on DEI. So I'm a CARE fellow, and CARE is our diversity center, but it's really a catch-all because we don't have many spaces for affinity groups or minority students. So we're doing a lot of work. We're doing education work, we're doing activism work, organizing work. But one of the issues we face and often discuss is how do we avoid constantly preaching to the choir? We get the same people in this space who already are educated on the topics or care about the topics. And so your talk really resonated because of the issue in which education might sometimes even have a backlash. And on this campus, we've been seeing a lot of discussions about critical race theory because our racial ethnic GE did not pass. We've seen discussions of Palestine. So there's been a lot of issues, and I asked the question of, is this an opportunity for education, or could education even be harmful or have backlash? But I guess a lot of ideas and issues here. So if I were to choose one question, it would be, what opportunity do you see to reach people who aren't the choir and to do so effectively?
Right, so one, I do want to encourage you to keep preaching to the choir, to keep affirming one another and keep supporting one another, because that knowledge can turn into action, and we do need the action. And so, I definitely understand the frustration in, not necessarily reaching the people you want to reach, but I do want to encourage you also to keep preaching to the choir, because doing this work takes community, and it can be exhausting and draining. So stay there for each other and continue to do that work. The other piece of your question is, how do you reach people who potentially may have these backlash effects? And I don't have a clear empirical answer for you right now, but there are some things that we might consider based on some prior data knowledge, which is thinking about, what does it mean to highly identify as white? And thinking it through questions of where people might find sources of esteem and self, and just sort of affirming a sense of self that doesn't necessarily rely on erasing other people's stories or narratives, et cetera. And so I don't have a great answer for you yet, but I also, I think structure also goes a long way. So I'm sorry to hear that the GE requirement didn't pass, because I also think, like, as an instructor, as a teacher, I have students who may or may not agree with everything that I say, but in that classroom, I build trust with them, and we come to understand one another, and they may not necessarily come to my position or come to what I think, which is not really the goal, but to have people continue to critically think about these things, even if it might be uncomfortable for them.
Thank you so much.
Hi, my name is Simran. I'm a junior studying. Is this on?
And I can hear you. I don't know
Okay.
about them.
Anyway, okay. It just didn't sound that loud to me. But anyway, so my question is like only tangentially related to your talk, but I've been wondering about it for a while, and this seems like a good place to ask. So it's about the term like PWI. So I've heard it a lot, and obviously I know what it is, and I think everybody does. But I'm wondering, like, because to me it seems like a lot of people think it's like a really bad thing, or like at least a suboptimal thing. But I'm just wondering, because like for example, CMC is like 6% black, but then California is 5% black, so it's like a bit more than the state population. And most of the students, or not most, but like the place that the most students come from is California. I think like 548 out of the whatever I saw, like 12 or 1,300. So I'm just wondering like what your take on it is, because to me, if it's like about the same like percent as the like state population, then it's like seems realistic. To me, it'd be odd if it was like 30% black, because it'd be like, where are all the black students coming from? Because there aren't that many in California. And people do come from other states, obviously, like I'm from Texas, but most of the students, like or the plurality of students are from California. So that's my question.
Yeah, so I guess I would ask, questions back. But I guess I would wonder, I don't know the demographics of CMC. But would you be, like you said something about I would be shocked if it was like 30% black, but would you be shocked if it's like 80% white? And I think there's, ways in which our institutions and our universities are about service to the state, service to the nation, service to society. And so if people are coming from different states, so matching the state demographics is one goal, right? And I would still ask, what are the experiences of those students at CMC? Do they feel supported? Do they feel belonging? Do they feel like this is the institution for them? So in terms of number, I would ask, well, like I said, I don't know, but it's the same thing where when we think about in some schools, like, why is the focus on black people being overrepresented in institutions of education, particularly given the amount of labor and the amount of discrimination that they've faced? If Native Americans are 1% of the college, yeah, it matches the state demographics, but could we do better? And what would we get from doing better or doing more? I just think the question is like, okay, we may have a goal, and we may be assessing how well we're doing towards this goal based on state population. But is it a problem if there's more? And if so, why? Because we don't seem to have necessarily question or stop and ask, well, for myself, I'm an academic, I'm a psychologist, I think it's 3% of black women in the demographics of psychology. There's lots of people who need to be served, though. The service, right, so from psychology, just because there's, potentially 3% of black psychologists, does that mean that we don't need more in service of community? I guess, so I'm not really answering your question directly. I just want to sort of think about, like, why is that the goal? When is overrepresentation ignored or doesn't stop people? And who are we serving? And who do we want to, build and support and all that stuff?
If I can just respond quickly, like for the black psychologist thing, I think it's like slightly different, because like being a psychologist, like there are a lot of like black people that need a psychologist and they might prefer like a black psychologist, but like being a college student, like a lot of people end up doing things that were like, it isn't as relevant. Like if you're in marketing, like if you're black or white, I guess it could matter.
Oh yeah, but I would
it's
say, that would matter. Like how,
maybe marketing was a bad example, so I'm gonna change it to software engineering.
I guess I would just say that Black communities have all the same needs as other communities. And so there's always going to be a need and a place for people to do good and service. And so I get the question. I really honestly do. I just want to pause and think about, you know, I don't know, what good and who are we serving and who needs service? So even if we're underrepresented, we're also underserved. And so like, and how can we address that underserving? And that's not just in, right, psychology, which I think about, you know, there's wealth, there's education, there's criminal justice, there's so many areas in which African Americans are experiencing disparities that I think, and education is also one of them. I just think that we're not at the place where we have to be satisfied with just meeting a certain demographic number. But that's opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Johannes Brown. I'm a first year at CMC, a neuroscience major. What was I say? I guess like my question is like how do we turn this like education into action? I think there's a lot of people who are like educated people, but they don't like do anything with that education, and just because they have that education, they feel that they're like better and like that's enough. But, like how do we like really like take educating like people of different cultures like about these experiences and like racism stuff like that and like turn it into like actual progress?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, I think we all contribute what we can. And there's always spaces for us to do more, right? And bring more to the table. In my work, I do show, right, a relationship, I didn't talk about it today, a relationship between like knowledge of history, perceptions of racism, and support for policy, right? So how you're thinking about what you think the problem is gonna influence what you think the solution is. And so I definitely get the ideas that we need to move beyond just talking about the solutions and doing, right? I also think that means, you know, not just to like turn it back to y'all, right? Identify perhaps like the people who are with you or in your cohorts, what's stopping you from action? And then seeing if there's something that can be addressed there. And then also thinking about action looks different for different people. Protesting is an action that's very visible and, you know, needed and brings, you know, light to particular issues. Sometimes being in spaces where people don't think you belong is action and contributing. So I just, you know, I think, you know, identifying what might be keeping people from engaging in action, but then also being flexible or open to the idea that what action looks like for different people may take different forms, and they can all be significant in contributing to what I would suggest trying to build this anti-racist world we could imagine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Isaac. Wow, this is loud. And I'm a philosophy and history major. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very inspiring, and I was very much kind of wondering about how this like interaction between knowledge and perception of racism plays among with like certain other factors in society. Like I was wondering whether you know anything about if the knowledge is somewhat transferable in terms of perception of other types of discrimination, or is it just like purely racism? And if it were racism, does it like include colorism? Does it include racism against other people? Yeah, kind of like just the extension information if possible. Thank you.
Yes, are you a psych major?
I am not. I work at a psych lab, but I'm not a psych major.
Those are all future directions and great questions. You know, philosophy and psychology did come together at certain points in history and sometimes today. So you can do both. Or you can, you know, choose one major. It's fine too. So yes, I think all of those are great questions. There is maybe not exactly your answer. There are other people who are looking at like critical gender history knowledge and how that might, you know, be related to perceptions of sexism and things. I don't have that work in my lab. We also try to think about, so here we presented black, white. So we also looked at other people of color. They tended to fall in the middle of black, white perceptions of racism and things. So I also think that's an interesting avenue as we think about coalition building and other forms. So all of your questions are great. I don't have the data yet, but I think that would be useful, interesting data to think through and to contribute.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm a junior here, and I'm a cognitive science major. I have two questions. The first one is quick, though. In terms of the empirical studies, when you ask participants the identity, like if they're a white student, low versus high identity association, what does that mean exactly? Or like, how are you asking students in terms of what that means?
Yes, so they have 8 items that they can agree or disagree with. And there's kind of like 2 forms of identity that we looked at. So one is kind of affective and emotional. So I feel good belonging to this category. I feel worthwhile belonging to this group, right? So that's about how you're feeling about belonging to, either whatever racial group you identify with. So it's left open, but in a study, we asked them, okay, which census box do you check? The other form is about how central that is to your identity. So it's important to me. It's a central part of who I am. And actually, we don't find the same kind of relationships with that form. It really is I derive good feelings from this identity group that seems to be where the action is. And so, yeah, it's a survey question. People can say, I agree with this, or I disagree with this. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My second question, actually, is still related to the second empirical research, I think it was. In the slide where you showed the connections, like with the plus minuses, and there was a minus in between racial identity. Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll go back.
No, I appreciate it. Okay.
We'll see how far we got to go back.
Yeah, it was that one.
Okay.
Yes. So I think what you had said was students who, no, let me not misquote this, but this connection between, on the negative, which racial identity, X condition, yes, and racism perception, even though it was a plus in all of the other sections, do you have any theories, or have you been able to figure out why there's still that disconnect between those two, even though like in the other sections, there seemed to be an increase in like knowledge gain, and like internally it seems to be like there is an increased awareness of racism in systems, but then there's this disconnect here. Sorry, that was a lot, but do you know why that connection is there?
So there's 2 ways to think about this. One is when you account for all of these other things, what's left over? Mm-hmm. And so, yes, these relationships, right at the top, the sort of serial path you have, suggests that, okay, you've engaged with this, you've learned something about it, it changes how I think about structure related to current policy, and yeah, these things are systemic racism. This racial identity by condition, and what happens that once you've accounted for those relationships, what's left over? And it's the identity piece. And so in that case, the white participants, again, it's how they're deriving perhaps feeling good about. And so if I, go with me, if I want to feel good about this category, and then this information is maybe suggesting I shouldn't feel good about this category, then I can do one of 2 things. I can maybe disidentify with being white, maybe it's not as important as I thought it was, or I can discount the information that might make me feel bad about belonging to this category. So I think some of that is what's going on here. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, that does answer. Thank you so much.
Hi, Phia.
Hi.
Professor Gabrielle Johnson, Philosophy Department. I was told to tell you my major, so I majored in philosophy. Just first, thanks so much for the talk. I always find your work so insightful and eye-opening and important. So thanks for sharing it with us today. I wanted to ask a theoretical question just about how this work engages or is connected to conceptual engineering programs, and in particular, how our concept of racism has changed over time. So the whole critical race tradition is helping to inform, I think, a change in our conception of racism as expanding beyond individuals to structures or histories. And so I'm wondering to what degree the subjects in your studies, if they're reluctant to take on that conceptual change, that is, they're reluctant to take on a notion of racism that would expand to structures, how that might intersect with some of the studies that you're doing. Because I can imagine a white student who is reluctant to think of the structural injustices as a form of racism. No amount of teaching them about those histories of racial inequalities is then going to get them to extend that notion of racism to the present issues that they're seeing. And so if anything, I could imagine them responding in such a way as saying, oh yeah, it's all that structural stuff. And so even more reason to think there's not any racism involved, because there aren't any, I don't know, old-timey, nefarious, mustache-twisting people who like have racial animus. And so I'm just wondering how you've confronted that in your work, and to what extent you've seen a sort of reluctance to take on that more informed notion of racism in your work.
Yeah, that's a great question. Two inconsistent things are coming to mind for me. Because so before there was this kind of consciousness raising about systemic racism, the theoretical, I don't want to say pushback, but questions was like, well, systemic racism really lets a lot of people off the hook, right? It's not what I've got going on in here and here, it's the system, and my gosh, systems are big, unchangeable, you know. And so it wasn't that people were necessarily dismissive of structure. It was the worry that people would kind of, oh yeah, of course it's not me, it's structure. Right. And that would just allow people to still maintain the structures in place, because what can I do about it? And so, side plug, that's why I really like thinking about this in this dynamic, that there's both people, human action, and systems that are in interplay with one another that sort of shapes what's going on. There is some work on how people are defining racism, and there is also a black-white gap in whether people define, right? So white Americans tend to define racism as essentially the problem of individual bias, right? Individuals with bad intentions who hate. And Black Americans also hold that, but also tie it to structure and thinking about discrimination, because they're experiencing, right, and not just with people, but in hiring or in the criminal justice system, that their experiences are speaking to them as a structural kind of phenomenon. But yeah, I don't know. I'd have to think more about, okay, the people who are resisting even talking about racism as structure, and whether you could get them to move.
Yeah, if I could just ask, for the details of the study, I noticed you vacillated between saying, to what extent is this indicative of racism and prejudice, to then talking more agnostically about, like, is this racism relevant? I take it something like that is toward trying to capture various individuals who might have diverse perspectives about the mere concept of racism.
Part of it mirrors just sort of thinking about these questions in different ways. Does it still hold when you talk about it one way versus another? So, right, the earlier stuff was very generalized, and when we started talking about voting, right, and voting history, it got fairly specific. We did also, in that study, ask them about systemic racism broadly as well. But this idea of racism relevant, it's just kind of, I don't want to say playing around with different ways of asking the question to see if is it about like the specific way I'm asking you this question, or is it a broader phenomenon that might also speak to just how you're conceptualizing what's going on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm a senior at Pomona College majoring in international relations, and my question is going to be about specifically how you asked how much you identify with being white, or how strongly do you feel white. And I was wondering if you asked that question after you presented those facts about like what's happening, or like facts about all these different instances of injustices that's done to Black Americans. I was wondering if they would change, like if they had a chance to change that, would they respond differently at the end? I was also wondering just like about that question in general, because that feels like that is really open to interpretation.
Yeah.
And I think that question essentially, in my mind, felt like could mean a lot to could mean very different things depending on, especially because when I, for example, I'm from Turkey, I'm Middle East, and I'm white by like the categorization, but I don't necessarily identify myself as white. So I don't know if like I would interpret that question like that, but I'm not sure if like other people did that, or if it's just about like how proud you are to be white. So I would love to for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so in one instance, we ask it somewhat vague so that multiple people, no matter how they identify, can answer the question. And then we can match to the sort of category they may have checked out. And, we considered, right, so there's also the question of multiracial people and how, right, when a multiracial person is answering my racial group, technically, right, they may be thinking of many different racial groups. And so that gets complicated, and more analyses and more nuance is needed for that part of the question. There is a assumption that we're making here that if they checked white and white only, right, we might ask you, none of these apply, please describe, or, so if they just check white and don't describe something additional or check multiple boxes, we do make an assumption that when they're answering about their racial group, that's the category that they're thinking about. But yeah, there's certainly, there have been studies where we ask the question open-ended, like, not the census categories, but what racial/ethnic background do you identify with? And people say lots of interesting things. We had to add the checkboxes back because we also saw some reactants, which is understandable. One was, it's just funny, it sticks in my mind. What is your racial ethnic background? Your survey is the root of all racism. Like, okay. So we had to check boxes back, right, so that we can at least do some analyses. But it is a data point that sticks in my mind,
So kind of following up with that, do you think they would, if they had the chance to, I guess this is like a potential study, if they had a chance to go back and change their answers, how white they felt, do you think would that like be a difference, or would that be a difference that mattered about education, because essentially that would kind of make them reconsider about their identity and how proud they should feel about their positionality?
Yeah, I think I forgot about that part of your question. I think that's a phenomenal question. We've played around with whether we've asked racial identity at the beginning, at the end, counterbalancing it. But I think what you're suggesting is a potential pre-post, right? And there could be really interesting differences for those who sort of stay the same, for those who increase, right, react by identifying more with their racial group, and those who might identify less. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, once again for the talk, and thank you all for your amazing questions. Please join me in thanking our speaker once again.
Thank you.